Tonight we will be, our workshop will cover hand pollination of seed crops with Heron Breen. So welcome to our workshop tonight, and it's going to be a fun one. I had a chance to prep a little bit with Heron, and I'm very, very excited. So I'm going to try and get through my intro very quickly so we can bring him on. Just a few housekeeping things. First of all, just wanted to give a thank you to our sponsors. These are our gold sponsors that you're seeing now. Just a few, they are in the program book. So please, you know, check them out, go to their websites, try to patronize them if you can, if you see something of interest that they may have. And then another thank you to our silver sponsors. Again, they are in the program book. They have graciously sponsored us and sponsored this conference and some of the other things that NOFA does, and we are indeed grateful to them. Are presenting, attending, and hosting from wherever you may be this workshop from land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. And we would like you to take a moment to find your location on this map that you see on your screen so that we can honor the land that we're coming from. For example, I'm from Springfield, Massachusetts. That's where I'm broadcasting from tonight. This was the tribal lands of the Pocumtuck tribe that went all the way from the Enfield border, Enfield, Connecticut, Massachusetts border, all the way to beyond Deerfield and touching the Berkshires. And so we want to pay homage to who had the land before. And as a side note, where I live in Springfield, this was actually land that was owned by a free Black man, Primus Mason. He set up many areas here in Springfield. He set up a home for retired Civil War veterans, for older people. He was the largest landowner here in Springfield, and that was something unheard of coming right out of the Civil War. So that's another added piece that I wanted to add. And so without any further ado, I will close my closing comments and then turn things over to Heron Breen, who I am very excited to hear from. And he's got a wonderful presentation. So Heron, you can go ahead and take yourself off of mute. I will stop sharing my screen and we can take it away.
Amazing, thank you, Anna. Welcome everyone. This is a different format for me, as I'm sure it's all for you. I'm very much used to doing these types of presentations out in the field with you present and with plants surrounding us, where we get to both look at them closely and try these things out. So bear with me while we try and to learn together in this new format. I think the first questions, you know, that people come across when they're looking at flowers or looking at, you know, their vegetables, and they're kind of, there's a lot of activity going on. We have all kinds of different vegetables in our garden. You know, we have things, everything from onions to tomatoes to squash to corn, and they all have this really unique, distinct life cycle. Often when we think about flowers, we're often given the example of the you know, lily or something, or an ornamental that often has these very obvious parts. And I think what I'd like to start is to talk about the parts and talk about how these different things show up differently. And all the, to me, I consider like the pantheon of plants do this so much differently. We're sort of limited to our singular hominid reproductive modality. Plants are not fixated upon gender. We have assigned gender to ourselves and to the world around us. Plants have this amazing capacity to have, we'll start here. There's plants that have male flowers on one plant and female flowers on a whole distinct plant. So within a population for that plant to reproduce, it has two forms, two different plants that are carrying very distinct, separate flowers. I'm going to use the words male and female, but I want folks to realize that that is really a construct, and probably a construct that we need to rename and rephrase and reboot as we start to look at plants in depth. So this dioecious, they call this, is sort of like two houses. Those are the types of plants that have male and female flowers on separate plants. And a good example of this is actually spinach. Spinach has a male plant and a female plant. And most of us don't let our spinach get to such a height that we would notice when it bolts, but it has these two different forms. And in fact, spinach also has a third form, and in some ways a fourth form. It actually has a plant that is hermaphroditic and also has females that will throw a male flower eventually if left long enough. So spinach is sort of doing all kinds of different things depending on its genetics, but also the stresses of the environment. And that's some of there's a morphological shifting that often happens. So we say something has these two forms, you know, this male and female plant, but just be mindful that there's always unique occurrences. So the other type of plant is something that's called Monacis. Now this is a plant that has male and female parts on the same plant. What's interesting about that is that there's plants that we're going to talk about, like squash, that they have these flowers on the same plant, but they're not in the same flower. What we mostly are familiar with when we look at something like a lily, or you know, the usual example we see on the internet, is what's called Andromedacious, or perfect flowers. Sort of apropos to what we're talking about with gender, interestingly enough, plants that contain both male and female parts in one flower, that the flower itself has those parts, are called perfect flowers. Imperfect, hence, is when those parts have been separated. So when we think about gender for human beings, it's kind of an interesting transposition, how we perceive perfect and imperfect. So the general parts of the flower, but first we're going to review. We got dioecious, which means two separate plants that have distinct flowers, male and female, on different plants. Then we have monacis, which is where which means one house, where the flowers are male and female are on the same plant. And within that monacis, we have what's called andromedacious, or perfect flowers, which means that each single flower contains the male and female parts. So just as sort of how we're going to proceed today, of course, the easiest flower to demonstrate this on is big squash flowers, okay? So this is a little bit, I'm trying to make sure that you can see this, and this is the problem with doing this. This is the female squash flower. I took off the corolla so that we could see more clearly what is the pistolate parts. So this is not the graceful arching sort of elongated thing that we often see on the internet when we talk about flower parts, but it has all the same parts. They're just kind of shrunken. This little part here, this ruffly orange, which is actually kind of like almost in some ways appears to be slightly hairy, and I recommend everybody go out to their own squash patch and look closely at this, because it's going to be harder for me to show this on camera. But that is the stigma, where the pollen will be like grabbed on, you know, basically will stick to when it's brought into contact. And this part is very sticky. And then this right here is sort of a fused style. The style is the thing that basically extends out and holds the stigma. In this case, these are more like struts, okay? And you can kind of see that they're not particularly graceful. But I want to sort of show you what's going on with this, is that this flower, which actually just opened today, when it is open, it creates a funnel. And the bee has to enter and has to kind of negotiate around the petal, the corolla, to go by, okay, the stigma. And then underneath that is this well. There's a thing down here called the nectary. And the nectary is full, and I have other flowers, but I just want to show you this. Like the nectary, you can take this off, and there's this whole piece in here on a good day will be full of nectar in the morning. And you can actually pluck a flower, or even with your finger, go in and taste it, or you can pluck a flower and you can actually drink this nectar. And it's something that I like to do with people when they come to my farm or when I'm doing demonstrations, because it tastes like the most amazing aromatic soda. It's so sweet. It just has something, and it's just dripping all over the place. That's what the bee is after. So the bee is trying to get down inside the flower when it opens into this big, funnel, and get in there. And the shape of the flower is actually forcing the bee to get to the bottom and rub the pollen that it has gotten from the male flower, which we'll talk about in a second, and get that all over the stigma as it's kind of nested in there. Bees are at their least irritable when they are supping on such nectar, particularly honeybees. And sometimes in the morning you can open one of these flowers, or you'll look in and there'll be anywhere from 2 to 6 bumblebees or honeybees within the flower, just peacefully supping. So we have the female flower in terms of the squash, and then the male flower. So I'm describing this, and we are talking about Monacis and Dioecious, and squash are Monacis. They have a male flower and a female flower on the same plant. So this is actually a male flower that's going to open tomorrow. And I'll actually show you the same. This is a female flower that's going to open tomorrow. And you can kind of see, this is the ovary. This is actually the fruit. And you'll see that again on this one right here. That's the fruit, which I have snipped off. And the male flower obviously does not have a fruit. It has more of a little cup, okay? And you find these on different parts of the plant in general. What I mean that is that generally the male flowers are really distinctly upright, and the female flowers are wedged in I guess you'd say it's kind of a, what do they call these? Geez, the word's escaping me for the moment. But this little spot here, where a leaf, and the branch continues forward. And so often the flower is underneath the leaf or kind of hidden. And again, this is a female flower that's going to open tomorrow. So you have this, you have this male flower, and I'm going to peel this open. It also has a corolla. And then you see its part. There we go. So what we have here is this whole structure is called the staminate parts, or the stamen. Sorry, this whole structure here. But what you have here is this cone, this kind of swirly yellow thing, which is covered in pollen in the morning, is called the anther. And then again, this is technically called the filament, okay? And again, it's more strut-like than kind of the gentle sort of, ornamental flowers that we see. But the reason why the bee or another insect is trying to go here first is because it's expressed upward. It's the most visible. They're using this open corolla as a target. And the male flower also, and if you can see, if you see that little kind of like indent there, that's a opening to that same well of nectar. And when I pull this off, you will see that there is a nectary in the male part as well. And so the bee is trying to get into there, and it's in the same situation with that same funnel, trying to get in there, get the nectary, suck that up, it gets covered with pollen, flies over to the female plant. Oftentimes it visits a number of male flowers before realizing that there's even more nectar in the female flower. So the plant is sort of tricking the bee. And so every plant has like a structure that it's using to encourage pollination, whether that's insect or air or, and so, most folks know that, for an example, that corn is wind pollinated. But just as we're talking about bees and squash, one of the things I've noticed is that bees love corn pollen, and they get on that corn, on those little corn parts, and are just so crazed for it that they end up knocking all this pollen down onto the silk. So it turns out that corn is indirectly bee pollinated, bumblebee pollinated. Honeybees don't seem to be interested. So we've seen that the parts of the squash flower, and I'm gonna stop there for a second and ask Anna if there's been any questions so far.
Yes, this is a good time to take a little commercial. And again, I'd like to encourage everyone, please use the chat feature to put in your questions. It should be a little device at the bottom of your page. Just hover on that, the chat feature will come up and you can send those questions in to us. But I did have one question to come in concerning timing for pollination. I'm sure you're going to get into this in the rest of your presentation, but is there an optimum time to pollinate versus not pollinate? You mentioned bees being at their least irritable, so that question did come up.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually the next step. So we're talking about like when these flowers open is obviously in the morning, and this is how sort of hand pollination, which we do these things for different reasons. Every flower is going to have, or every plant's going to have, with hand pollination, mostly ideal times, and most of that is in the morning, and there's some reasons for that. One of them is the flowers are at their freshest, so by 1 o'clock, this fresh flower has wilted. And the same with the male flower. And that wilting, the female is still receptive, but the pollen donor, the male part, this pollen has cooked, basically has steamed and cooked and is useless. So the female in squash, and often with many plants, the ovary is receptive for often more than 1 day, but often that the pollen is generally only good for a day unless it's been stored, and that's a kind of a different discussion. So what we're doing with pollination, and there's different reasons people pollinate. Some people just do hand pollination because they want to get more production off of, say, a squash or a melon or a cucumber or something. And they sometimes the bees don't arrive, or there doesn't seem to be bees in your region, and so people often want to just rub flowers together. They're not necessarily intending to do any seed saving or plant breeding. The next part of this is people use hand pollination to do seed saving, and seed saving in a way is part of plant breeding. And beyond that, and kind of like the professional quote level, all of the hybrid seed, not all of it, but a lot of the hybrid seed that we utilize as farmers and gardeners has had hand pollination as part of its production process. So that's an intentional cross between 2 parent lines made repeatedly. That's how we get, say, hybrid tomatoes. So you can use this for lots of different reasons. The timing with squashes, and this is kind of a unique time to do this because I'm often giving this talk in the morning, and things have already kind of opened up. And so here I have like a couple different flowers, and these are all flowers that are going to, are female flowers that are going to open tomorrow, okay? And I want to show you one that isn't going to open tomorrow. You see this kind of green, more intact cone, and see how this flower has this parting of the corolla. This sort of, I call it the smooch. I don't know, it's not a technical term. But the petals on the corolla start to parse open. And that happens on the afternoon of, or sort of as the day progresses. And this color change, this flower here is probably 2 days from opening. And this flower would be opening tomorrow. So when we're doing hand pollination, what we're trying to do is not let the bee get into the flower if we're doing seed saving, okay? If we're just trying to get more fruits and we're not concerned about all that, then we'll talk about that in a second. But what we have is this structure, okay? And it's the same with the male. The male also, even more, has this sort of pronged opening and this more yellow color. And again, this is a male flower that is probably a day or two away from opening, and you see that kind of green hardness, and it's really not really, he's pretty obviously an immature. That is for a lot of people the hardest thing, the timing of when a particular flower for a particular species is open. And squash is a great way to get used to this. The other way to get used to this is no matter what type of plant you're dealing with, take a piece of string, tie it around a flower that's obviously not opened, not around the flower, but on the stem. And then just keep watching that flower for a couple days as it progresses. And you will see how these little parts change. And that becomes your visual cue for what's going on. And so the timing for this type of thing is, there's a process, and I'm going to walk a little bit through this process with squash, and I'm just using this as an example before we move forward, because we are going to move on to other things. I want to tape these closed or use some sort of thing to to pinch this off, because this flower is going to explode into this beautiful corolla that no bee nor human can ignore. As early as 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, you can't be there early enough. And the bee is going to beat you. This is their job. They're professionals. We're just kind of visiting. And they're going to get into that flower. You're not going to be able to get into that flower before them. Now, if you're just doing some hand pollinating and you're just trying to rub some pollen and stuff and get more fruit because your bees are maybe a little bit not present, or you're just trying to get an early set, don't worry about this part. But really what you're trying to do is rub these flowers together in the morning. And for those of us that have jobs, that can be as early as 6 or 7 in the morning. The pollen for this stuff is ready and ripe as early as 6 or 7, particularly on a summer day. Never really had any issues with that side of the thing. And it's good, depending on the heat in the day, usually up until 11 a.m. and sometimes a little longer, but 12 you start to have issues, starts to get too hot. So I'm usually trying to pollinate between say 7 in the morning to about 10. But if you have a job, you can do a little bit of this stuff and then go to work. In the evening when you get home, which is where we're all at right now, there's this part that you do, particularly for seed saving or plant breeding, where you take, in this case, I'm going to show you this is a twist tie. This is basically a bread tie, okay? And you can buy these by like the thousands or whatever. They're really cheap. I bought these from Quill, and it's just a wire twist tie, okay? And this is the female flower. And you can see that there's these petals actually kind of, the corolla itself incisors down. And so you actually want to be putting this on below that, because when you put this on, those incisions will just open up into these huge seams. And let me give you a little background. When I first started doing this, I used to paint houses for a living. So I used painter tape, which sticks to supposedly everything. And it's supposed to be super good and and humidity. And these flowers will blow that stuff right apart. They're so strong, they don't care. They just tear that stuff right off. And I was like beside myself about what I was going to do. So this little trick with the twist tie is great. I also have come to use adhesive medical tape. I've made a switch to the twist ties mostly because I know that we're having a medical pandemic situation going on, so I'm not using this. I haven't bought any of this year. But this is waterproof medical tape, and it has a great purpose. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. You can use any adhesive medical tape that you might find at the store. The reason why that is because that stuff sticks even if you have like a rainstorm or something overnight. That stuff will not come off, whereas painter tape and other stuff will. But this twist tie, you have to be sort of gentle because you're imagining this is still attached to the plant, and I'm usually on my hands and knees doing this because I'm right next to it. But rather than doing what you normally might do if you're closing up a bag of bread or what have you, you're laying this flat across the flower. And I am folding this, okay? So that I am getting something like that. And you can fold this again if you want, so that it looks, so that it's closed up, or you can leave little wings. And I do that to both the male and the female. The reason I don't twist it is because when you twist it, it tears the flower. It tears the edge. And so what I've done is I pinched this off, and I kind of like take my finger and I pinch a little bit and I pinch a little bit, all done. And believe it or not, this works amazingly well. And I can reuse these twist ties. I use them the whole season until the wire runs out. And it's a really great thing. And I also do the same with the male flower. And again, I want to get below, okay, but I don't want to get too below. You see how I'm kind of like up? See down here is actually that part of the flower. You're dealing with the stigma here. You don't want to get anywhere near that. If you damage that, the flower will basically get weird inside. It's still in a formative process. It's actually still undergoing change. And the same thing with the male. You want to be sort of about, 2/3 or halfway up, because there's actually something in there, i.e. the actual anther itself is sort of still in there. Then in the morning, I get out there and this thing has ballooned, has become a, I'm just going to put one of these on here just to sort of, show you more of what this might look like in the morning. But, you basically, this whole thing is like this huge, kind of like this thing's kind of constricted, kind of enlarged, and this thing's still pinched off. The plant's ready to, really wants to, but it can't get this thing off. And so what I'm doing is I am undoing one of these, and then I am undoing this, and then I'm actually plucking this. This obviously stays on the plant. I'm plucking this, and I'm using it as its own paintbrush. I peel it off with my fingers, and I take off these sepals. You see these little pointy things around the edge? They get in the way of going in the flower. So you want to take it right down to that. That is then, okay, being introduced into this wonderful funnel. And you are basically going in there, and I'm going to tear this so you can see. You're basically rubbing this thing, from below with all kinds of pollen. Okay. And you can see sometimes the males are not actually, they look ready and they've gone through their process and there's not any pollen on them, and you can usually, it's very obvious. But there's usually plenty of good pollen. And you don't necessarily need more than one, but two is often good if you can find two that are good that you've closed up the night before. And you rub this around, and then I reclose the female flower. So I just tore this off to show you, but I reclose it, okay? That means nothing else can get in there. And within a little bit of time, this all wilts and no bee can get in there and pollinate. And then you've basically done whatever deed that the bee would have done. So I'm gonna stop there and ask Anna if there's any questions. Oop, Anna, I think you're on mute. I can't hear you.
There I go. Okay.
Yes.
Second time I did it. Okay. No, I don't see any additional questions. People are saying that was a very clear explanation, so thank you for that.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that are fun about this is that, and squash is a good one to start getting your eye keen. You notice I've been holding up a lot of different flowers. Notice how they all have different shaped fruits and different color fruits, okay? This yellow fruit is gonna be red or something like red, orange or something. This green fruit is probably gonna be dark green. It may have some streaks. You can actually see some ribs, some ridges on it. And it actually will dictate, you can see this, see that? Actually tell you what kind of fruit you're gonna find on there. Meaning this is probably gonna be more of a buttercup type thing or a kabocha. This is gonna be something, a rounded shouldered kabocha. So there's some stuff when you're looking at fruits and flowers that you begin to realize that individual varieties have distinctions and some really interesting distinctions. So I'm gonna show you something crazy. And this goes back to the wild, wacky things that sometimes happen. This is a weird male flower. I think you'll notice that it has something going on to it. And it is not really like this, the female that we're normally used to. This is an Andromedacious or a false Andromedacious squash flower that has both male and female parts that are encapsulated in the flower. And it's kind of hard to see, and maybe I will pull you'll see that there's these outer pieces. This is the male part. And if I pull those off, you'll see that the female part is within underneath them. There's some varieties that do this, or like very, and you notice these things. This is the fun of looking more closely at things. And you'll see that it has kind of this weird ovary thing. I've never seen one of these actually create a fruit, but I have spoken with people that have managed or found different squashes that will do that or do something. It's a little weird. So this is the fun of doing that. And usually when you're doing your hand pollinations and you've retaped this thing, you want to tie some type of twine. What I do is actually I use this twist tie and I go back. Either this is that flower, imagine I've retaped it, twist tied it. Either I go around this little stem and I leave of the squash itself, and I leave it very loose so that it doesn't choke the squash. Or I go back, more often I go back here behind the fruit itself. So this axial node, that's what they call these, sorry. These axial nodes, I go behind the axial nodes and I make a loose, you could use twine, you could use whatever is easy. Since I'm using these twist ties, I use the twist tie. That tells me that that fruit was pollinated, because in a couple of weeks or even just a few days, this is gonna get all wilty, this is gonna fall off, and then I have to go around and make sure I pick these up. But this just gets all, blah. And if you don't tie it, you can't, if you don't put a little thing on it, you can't tell that you did it. And you will have basically done something without knowing. For seed saving, this is important because you'll want to know that fruit there is one that I did seed saving on versus all the other fruits that the squash might set. So using something to denote that that fruit was your goal is really good. And if you were doing some kind of plant breeding, sometimes people use ribbons that they can write on. There's, let me see if I bring a garden pen. Basically, make sure you use a sunproof pen or even a pencil. Make sure there's garden markers. If you're going to make any kind of notations on any kind of ribbon or any kind of whatever that says this is what this was, use something that's sunproof. I have been the person who didn't do that, and then all of the work was gone. So I'm going to stop with squash for a second. Is there anything that folks have to ask about squash itself specifically before we might move on to another plant to kind of explore how we might hand pollinate that and its flowers, and pretty much anything at all about working with hand pollinating with squash? We can sort of talk about right now.
There is one question that came in, Heron, concerning cucumbers.
Mm-hmm.
Would this include cucumbers? And I'm sure you're going to talk about that.
Well, I can, yeah.
But if you want to touch on it now, that would be great.
Sure. I actually have a melon vine, and I have a watermelon vine with me, kind of to show these similarities. It's a little harder, and I'm just going to use the melon vine because you get the scope of that's a baby melon, which is quite a bit smaller than that. And it does make a challenge your observation to know when that flower is going to be open. This just opened today. It didn't survive the ride here home very well. But similarly, they basically have another, like a layer, like an enclosed kind of little cup that you might find. It's a little bit different than this. It's not as big and it's more kind of rounded, okay? And I'm gonna show you, yes, the twist ties do not work. And what I have discovered is that grafting clips work pretty well on cucumbers and melons. It takes a little bit of practice. This is a little bit clunky because this is already opened, but basically I've clipped that, okay? And that's sort of what I would do the night before, okay? And I do put something on this. The ones I use have like a big, like a white piece of tape or an orange something that's a little, so I can see that I did that. Because these are like, tiny. I want to show you the male flower, where I have one of these. And again, like this little tiny thing is the male flower that's going to open tomorrow. And that would also get a clip. Now, the great thing about cucumbers versus the squash, cucumbers and melons, is that the actual parts themselves are farther in. They don't extend out. They don't kind of extend out into the flower. So this clipping process doesn't damage the actual part. And it's a very similar thing where I'm taking, this is a male flower that opened today. Again, you can see it doesn't have an ovary. And I am, again, using this as a paintbrush. It's a little more of a process because it's tiny. And this is why melon breeding and cucumber seed saving are kind of hard to do. But anyways, yep, you got yourself a little thing. And that little thing is, again, going down in this funnel, and same process. It's just using a slightly different process to close these, and then again, reclipping it, tying it, saying you did it. Now the difference is also that the success rate with doing melons, cucumbers is actually probably about 50%. They actually like to set a lot of fruit. Melons are more like 25 to 10%. It's hard to get, the hand pollination takes are harder, and consequently bees actually make more visits per fruit. And I'm saying that in comparison to squash. Squash, you can often get to a point with practice where you've got almost 100% of your pollinations will set fruit. And so the challenge with melons and cucumbers is being attentive and having a slightly different tool. And these grafting clips, which have become way more common, and you can buy them through Johnny's or other places, have become a really good, easy go-to thing. Fits in my pocket. Again, reusable. The tape, I've used it, doesn't really work. I have tiny tape for this stuff, and it's great and all, but these clips are saving my mind.
I've got
So
one more. Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, no, go ahead. Yep.
I've got one more question about the difference from the mother plant. So it is the simple pollination and actually changes the seed within the fruit. That's part one. And when it matures, those seeds will now be different from the mother plant?
Well, that depends on how you do it. If you're saving seed from one variety, so let's say it's like Waltham butternut, okay, and you're pollinating one Waltham butternut plant to another Waltham butternut plant, you're just creating more Waltham butternut seeds, okay? The bees doing their business, if you had something else, so just to be clear, there's different species of squash, like acorn squash is different than buttercup, which is a bit different than butternut. So you have pepo, which is your zucchinis and your acorns and your pumpkins usually, and then you have maximas. These are different species, which are your buttercups, your kabochas, that kind of thing. And then you have your butternuts and cheese pumpkins, and those are the machadas. And those are generalizations because there's lots of other variations within those species, but just generally. So if you're taking Waltham butternut male flower and rubbing it on Waltham butternut female flower, you're creating more Waltham butternut seeds. The bees, if you had a cheese pumpkin in that patch or near that Waltham butternut, the bees are not really going to distinguish they don't care which variety. They're just making the rounds. So you could be using seed saving, using hand pollination, you could seed save a particular variety and have other things that are related to it nearby. But here's just one caveat. Also, there's something called selfing and sibbing, and this goes for all plants. And selfing is when, like I said, squash are monacis, which means they have male and female flowers on the same plant. When you use the same male flower to the same female plant flower, so that same plant's both male and female flowers, that is called selfing. And squash do not suffer from the same level of inbreeding depression that other plants do when you do this thing called selfing. And people utilize it in plant breeding and sometimes in seed saving when necessary. And generally this thing called sibbing is where you're taking a male flower from an adjacent nearby neighbor and applying it to the flower of a different plant, a female flower of a different plant. So it is the pollination process in general that creates the swelling of the ovary swells, but it will fall off and rot if it is not pollinated. So the formation of seeds due to pollination is 90% of the time what allows a fruit to actually ripen and give you the thing that you want to eat. Butternuts are a little bit of an exception. For some reason, butternuts can be triggered to set fruit and will have very few and sometimes no seeds or no viable seeds within the fruit. So sometimes they can there's not really anything parthenogenic squash, but butternuts sometimes do this thing. But yes, pollination is the key, and it is the key for quality fruit. And so if you have early pollination, a well-adapted variety to your region should set fruit early enough so that 40 to 50 days from that pollination is when that fruit will be ready for your consumption. So you want something, a variety that will produce enough flowers, enough over a course of a week or two, that'll set fruit, that'll ripen in time for harvest. If there's not pollination, you're basically not getting a harvest. So our bee friends are doing 90% of this work. This hand pollination technique is just a way for us to do some seed saving and maybe even enhance our harvest. What you will also find, there's a little notation on this, is that sometimes you go out and you go like, wow, this plant is throwing off a lot of male flowers early on, and this is by variety. The different varieties differ, literally right next to each other in the field. You can have a plant that, a variety that it throws all kinds of male flowers initially. No females, all kinds of males. Conversely, there can be a variety right next door that throws all kinds of female flowers and no male flowers and runs like crazy. And that is sort of like, it's like the early warning system for the bees. It kind of gets them involved, and then the plant sort of does its thing with the overlapping of the male and female. And sometimes that takes 5 days to 10 days for them to line up. So I often get calls from people who are like, my squash is only producing male flowers. That can be a nutritional deficiency, but most of the time it's actually just wait 5 days and then they come into sync with each other. So I'll stop there for a second and see if there's any more questions before we move on.
There's one that came in, Paul Freenan, High Mowing Seeds. He says here, Paul's kids, could you cross a cucumber with a squash? And I'm assuming it's in the pollination process. Is that possible?
It is not possible. I wish it was. Or I don't know if I want cucumbers crossed with squash, but sometimes I wish there was brassicas you could cross with tomatoes so they could tolerate the cold. Well, kind of in that mode, I'm going to hold up a fruit that doesn't really seem to be that unique to anybody else. But this is actually what's called an interspecial cross between a Maxima and a Machada. So this is a Kabocha crossed with a Butternut. Okay. And this was an accident initially that, you know, I saw. This happens every so often in seed, and it's more and more, you know, the more you do work with plants, the more you might see something with this. More often than not, the seeds that are within that really crazy thing are totally not viable, like they're empty. There's nothing in them. So it'll produce a fruit, but there's either no seeds or the seeds are not viable. But depending on the situation, you can get really tasty fruits that have viable seeds. And so the parent to this, the original, well, the second round of things, had about 5 viable seeds in every fruit. And so this is actually a breeding project that it's really cool. It looks kind of like a beautiful pear-shaped thing. It's incredibly sweet and keeps all the way until you're sick of squash in June. So there's crazy things that occur, but no, watermelons won't cross with melons, cucumbers won't cross with squash. What you sometimes do see is that bees really like cucumbers, and or they're because there's a lot of flowers, particularly honeybees. And there's something called pollen compression where the bee can be attracted to something else. And you're wondering why I'm not getting any fruit set, even though the squash are going crazy. So just be mindful that if you have like 3 winter squash and then like 20 row feet of cucumbers, you might get a lighter set on your winter squash than you were hoping, because the bees are off dealing with that and you don't have a lot of flowers on your winter squash. It's not because they've crossed and caused trouble. All right. That's a lot of squashy talk, which is awful lots of fun. It's a little hard to demonstrate tomatoes because they're so freaking small. Apologize for the language. But I figured it was important to talk about things that are different. And you know, what we were talking about with the squash is utilizing a bee. And I mentioned the corn being wind pollinated. So we're just going to do a little walk through different crops that are sort of different types of pollination. So corn is mostly wind pollinated. I mentioned the bumblebees loving the corn pollen and nectar and knocking all kinds of pollen down onto the silks. But that's obviously not its primary form of pollination. Things like spinach and beets. People say these are kind of wind pollinated, and they are. But I have a spinach seed crop in my breeding project in my home garden, and there's all kinds of little tiny cyprid waspy type thingies crawling all over those flowers. So I have a hard time believing that there's not some transmission of pollen by pollinators when they're present. But for the most part, the flowers are so small that you and I doing any kind of hand pollination with something like a beet or a spinach is never going to happen. Beets are considered to be wind pollinated, but if you ever grow a beet seed crop, which I really recommend people do, even ornamentally, save a beet over, a couple of them, plant them out. They are biennials, which means they set their seed the second year. They throw a huge upright stalk that can be as tall as 3 to 4 feet. And they smell incredibly sweet. And you walk by them and they are just like emanating this honey, almost sickly sweet smell, and are alive with little tiny, again, fly-like bee things, probably cyprid wasps and all kinds of things. So when we sort of make rules and say something's wind pollinated, sometimes there's something else going on if there's something present. Things like to have 2 ways to go. And then there's things that are called self-pollinating. And that generally means that the flower itself, by the time it opens, it's a perfect flower. So we were talking about squash being monacious, but they're not andromedacious except for those crazy male flowers I showed you, which are weird. They're not perfect flowers. They don't have the male and female parts all in the same flower. But a tomato does. And a tomato, for the most part, it pollinates itself basically before the tomato flower opens. And so it's called, and peppers do this. Eggplants a little less. There's such big flowers that there can be some bee activity going on. But beans and peas are self-pollinating. So the bean flower that you see fully open has already pollinated itself before it was open. And this makes this whole hand pollination process a little more difficult because it's about becoming familiar, similar with the squash, with those different stages of fruit. So, or different phases of flower. And it's going to be hard for me to demonstrate this because of the tininess of the flowers of tomato. But you can sort of see, like, that's your standard tomato flower. It's fully open. And tomatoes have this funny thing. It's called an anther cone. And it's actually, this whole yellow thing is actually all of your sort of staminate, your anthers all wrapped together. They're like a solid tent, I guess you would say, around your your style and your stigma. Your style and your stigma is this tiny little thing inside the center of that. And so the pollen is being shed in to the style and stigma and has already pollinated by the time this thing is popped open, okay? And I would show you, and I'm not sure you're gonna be able to see this. This is where this video thing, there's a little flower here that I've actually taken. Maybe if I put my finger behind it, I don't know, but you can see this tiny little thing. I've taken the anther cone off. And that little white thread thing that you see, if you can see that, sticking out of the flower, okay, that is the stigma and the style, okay? And the reason I did that is because in this little cluster of flowers, potential flowers, you'll see there's like little green ones that are nowhere near opening. And then you see these two. Those two are actually basically ready, meaning they haven't pollinated the stigma and style yet. The pollen isn't ready yet. And those are the ones that, for an example, if I wanted to cross a brandywine with a sun gold or something, I would have to, words that we don't like to say, I would have to emasculate this flower, which involves basically taking off this cone and exposing the style and then rubbing some pollen on it from an open, fully mature flower. And so it's a little more of a complicated process. Believe it or not, it's actually not that difficult. Often this cone will come right off or will be able to be teased off with your, sometimes you kill a few, but luckily tomato flowers are really, oh, I did it. It's lovely. I love it when I do that. This little thing, you can't really see it, but that little thing is that anther cone. I just pinched it, and I don't really even have fingernails, and it came right off. And if, again, there's a little slender thing, it's hard to see, it's a little thread, that's the stigma and style. And I would rub this on there, okay? And I would, if I really want to do this, I'd pluck off these other flowers that could become fruit, and I'd tie a little string on here. And so I'd have that pollinated fruit on that one thing. And this is how people make hybrid tomato seeds. This is the process that produces all of the hybrid cherry tomatoes and slicers, that somebody is doing this process one thing at a time, and has gotten this down where they can do hundreds in an hour, or a bunch in an hour. The same is true with peppers. This is a very similar process with peppers. So hybrid peppers, hybrid eggplants. There's some other processes being used as well. So I'm not going to say it's solely this, but that's the basic process. So it's pretty crazy, really. I mean, it seems like a very delicate process, but honestly, it's almost as easy as the squashy stuff, and has almost the same consistent take rate once you get used to doing it. And I am not good at it, and I don't really have good fingernails. I sometimes use a pair of tweezers to pop it off. Some people are really good at using a toothpick, but you get good at it. And this is how you can breed your own tomatoes. Pretty crazy stuff. So I'll stop there with the tomatoes and see if there's any questions, because I probably skipped over some important things.
No questions at this time that I can see. I will put out another request to our audience, and I'd like to welcome some newcomers that may have come over from the other. Oh, here we do have a good question from Christy. Is there a need to prevent unwanted insect pollination on the tomato flowers after you process? That is a great question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Once you tear off, so that thing I tore off, a lot of what comes with it is actually all of the petals too, the corolla itself. And so if that isn't the case, then you can sort of pinch those off. Without a target, the bee is not attracted. And a really well-renowned plant breeder used to have a technique with the squash, where they would just after pollinating, rather than retaping or whatever they were doing, they would just peel off the corolla and just let this part be exposed. And they watched that process and discovered that basically without the target, the bee is not interested in this. With the tomatoes, it's totally fine. With the squash, the reason why that's more difficult is I don't entirely fully agree with that all the time. I've definitely seen a little bit of visitation. The other thing is tearing the corolla off. This is you've seen on the bottom of the squash, like on the bottom of a kabocha squash or even a buttercup. There's a little, like what they call a blossom end scar, basically. There's a little scar where this was attached. And if you damage this, the fruit will not form. And there's some fruits some types of squash really susceptible to damage of this corolla part. So the removal of the corolla as a standard practice is not done by most people when they're doing plant breeding or seed saving. But it was practiced at one time. It really is variety by variety, and I suspect if you had really practiced it, you could get good at it. The other thing that this person used to do is they used to take a toothpick or their thumbnail, in this case I'll just use tweezers, and they used to, on the fruit itself, make an X in the baby fruit. And that would tell them later on, that would turn into a big scar. It would tell them that that was the one that they pollinated. Again, this person had many years of practice, and maybe this probably didn't always work because, again, damaging the fruit can cause the fruit to fall off. With the tomatoes, it's pretty much, there's plenty of other tomato flowers. Bees do visit tomato flowers, particularly the fully open ones, but very unlikely for them to visit these emasculated flowers.
Mhm. And another question just came in concerning cucumbers and zucchini. Why do we get cucumbers and zucchini with pointy ends and the rest of the fruit is normal and larger diameter than the end?
Well, I'm not sure if maybe you're talking about necking, but also, like, yes, malformed fruit, which in zucchinis and cucumbers, you know, they set such a big ovary, the fruit itself, you know, again, this thing, just as a zucchini. They set this large zucchini that even without pollination will produce a fairly large fruit. Eventually it might wilt or fall off. Some varieties are able to hold that zucchini without having actually been pollinated, that quality, for a while. But there's a thing that pollination does encourage better formation of sort of your standard fruit. So if something isn't being pollinated, there can be issues there can be partial pollination, which can cause that, but a lot of that has to do with heat or water stress. The misshapen fruit often has to do with the zucchini or the cucumber either being too hot or too water stressed as it was setting, and that actually affects the ovary itself. And you may, if you're a greenhouse grower, you may know that when your cucumbers are in a greenhouse, there gets to a point where it's like too hot sometimes if you don't have venting and a shade cloth, where basically the cucumber will stop setting. And that goes for pretty much whether it's whether it's Gynaeus or Parthenocarpic or whatever, you'll have a dead spot because of the heat. So it's an extension of that with the cucumbers, and usually it's just if you pull those off, and I always recommend pulling off the malformed fruits and letting another batch of fruit come in, because the second batch of fruit is invariably better. Some varieties of zucchini just have a sort of a bad first set. There's some varieties that and this is why we like certain varieties, because you don't see that. And there's other varieties where it seems like they have a little more of that on either end of the season. It's the front end to the back end. It's definitely variety specific. Yeah, go ahead.
I see no additional questions. So.
Okay. Well, I am gonna. I guess we have about a half an hour left, and I'm wondering if there's anything that anyone would specifically want to know about, like a specific question, whether it's about something we've already talked about, or another type of plant, or anything else that's related to hand pollination or even seed saving, if there's something that somebody would want to ask. So I'm just going to let that open up and see if there's any kind of 15 minutes of just open forum here.
And folks, if you want to speak, just take yourself off of mute by using that lower left button at the bottom of your screen, and you can go ahead and ask a question.
I have a question.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, forgive me. I did join late and I missed the first section. I'm sorry, I had to work late. But you were talking a little bit about if you had a lot of cucumbers planted near squash, there may be some, I don't have the right terminology, but maybe competition between pollination. I'm just wondering, do you recommend that cucumbers and squash don't share the same space? For those of us with small spaces and raised beds and sort of intensive backyard gardening, do you recommend that we separate the squash and the cucumbers for that reason, or does it really not make a difference?
It generally doesn't make a difference. It's just occasionally somebody has isolated a couple random squash where they have like one butternut plant in amongst a whole bunch of other plants, and they don't get what they thought they should for yield. I think the main reason to separate winter squash and, say, melons or cucumbers is because the viney nature of the winter squash is going to overrun your cucumbers and make it hard for you to get in there and pick. And I will say that the powdery mildew that squash can harbor, and as farther south as you get into downy mildew stuff, sometimes having them too close or even in the same plot can kind of give everybody a problem. So I tend to separate my cucumbers and my melons relatively far because I have the same challenge. I mean, I have a couple of nice little isolated seed saving gardens, and they're a 35-40 garden. You know, they're the same size if anyone's sort of medium to large size garden. And you just, there's a lot of nice bush stuff that people should explore. Bush options. There's also bush watermelons, and there's also bush melons. So just be mindful of that when you're thinking about space.
Bush. Oh, I wasn't aware of bush varieties.
Yep. They call them short internodes, which just mean that they're super productive along a shorter stem.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for that question, Jessica. That was a great question. There was a question that came in about pollinators. Have you seen a lack of pollination due to lower numbers of pollinators?
In some years, I definitely have seen, I really pay attention to bumblebees because the honeybees can be attracted to a lot of different things. And honestly, winter squash, for an example, honeybees didn't evolve with squash. They've actually evolved with melons and cucumbers, and they don't really have a long enough proboscis to drink, or whatever snout to drink into that deep nectary that I was showing earlier in the squash flower. Whereas you saw the melon flower is really tiny, and they can get in there and do whatever they want. So I really pay attention to the bumblebees, and there's a lot of neonicotinoids that are utilized in potato fields and other fields, and I feel that the bees do visit those, and I do feel like there is often a decline related to that. And yeah, it seems like it goes in waves. I live in a relatively rural area but I'm surrounded by many larger agricultural fields that are using sometimes systemic pesticides, and yeah, it's a huge issue. And I would never want to assume that hand pollination should do the job of the pollinator. The pollinator needs to be preserved at all costs. This is only like a shortcut or a seed saving technique. And I do know that folks sometimes in some areas, you do utilize this for winter squash because they're just not getting the set that they need and the bumblebees just aren't present.
Excellent question. We do have it's 6:12, so we have a few more minutes left if there are any additional questions about what we've covered tonight. And I'm telling you, Heron, we're going to have another workshop leader in the conference, was a contemporary of Heron, Petra Page Mann from Fruition Seeds. Okay, Heron, this is a Fedco question. What is exciting that Fedco is working on? I want to know that one myself.
Well, you know, Fedco is not a breeding company. I personally do plant breeding on my own farm. We work with a number of independent breeders like myself, but we're also very, you know, attached to heirlooms, and we're always looking for a really good adapted hybrid. So, you know, for me, the things that are interesting is, you know, right now we're in the midst of zucchini trials, which seems like, why is that interesting? But it's really interesting to see which varieties really are way more productive than another variety. And it's like side by side, you know, 20 different green zucchinis. You know, and it's really interesting to see, okay, this particular zucchini variety, you know, one, just for an example, there was one that it just continued to maintain this very elongated, narrow shape, even when it got to be about 15 inches long. So it didn't get all bulky. You know, I don't know, I mean, the quality definitely changed, but, you know, the trialing process is really exciting and something that I really am invested in at Fedco. And we've had a very stressful season. And these are the types of seasons that we get to see the real winners in a stressful environment, whether it was extreme heat and drought that we saw, which we saw up here in Maine, basically no rain from basically the middle of May through effectively the end of June. So it was like 7 or 8 weeks with the equivalent of half an inch of rain. It was very, 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 very dry and very hot. So to see things do really well in that environment, either things that we're currently carrying or things that we might carry in the future, that's the kind of stuff, like, I know that we've all been having a challenge, but that's the stuff that really shows me and us what is reliable in our environment. It's not the finicky, you know, things that need to be pampered. It's the ones that just do what's needed. So that's what I'm excited about.
And Christy, if you want to take yourself off of mute, you have a great question about a particular pest that I cannot stand. So Christy, go ahead and take yourself off of mute. You can use that button in the lower left.
I've worked at Old Sturbridge Village for a long time, and maintaining heirloom varieties at the village has been a joy and a challenge for us. For many years, we were trying to maintain proper varieties of the Boston marrow squash, the antique Boston marrow. Mm-hmm. And one of our biggest challenges was squash vine borers. As I'm sure you know, there are certain species of squash that are much more vulnerable to that. And I know at home I've been able to control them on bush varieties of squash by tenting my squash with remay until the flowers open. And by doing that, I think I have prevented the time when the insect laying the eggs was most likely to happen. I've been able to prevent that. But that's not so easy to do with vining varieties of squash. And with winter squashes, I think, you know, because they keep flowering longer. Do you have any tips for the vine borer control at all?
So, you know, luckily in some ways, Maine does not, at least where I'm in Maine, doesn't have vine borer. So it's definitely a pest that's moving our way. but it hasn't reached us yet. But I will, first of all say I got some of the Boston marrow that I grow for myself, I originally got from you folks years and years ago.
Oh,
It was one of the first varieties that I was really playing with, and I have pictures of my son, who's now 18 and about 3 years old, next to Boston marrow is the same size of him. So I thank you for doing that work. And I think that, you're on the right track with the remay, the row cover. I use row cover extensively because I don't want to spray and I don't want to interfere with the pollinators. So I let those viney squash even get very mature and flowering, or starting to at least flower underneath that row cover, and so that they're pushing or tenting up against it. And yes, those leaves sometimes don't come out, they can kind of look a little funny, but it's going to grow more leaves. So as long as you can keep it under there for as long as you can, until, sometimes I go, maybe sometimes it's 20 days, sometimes it's even longer depending on if the season is short. I think also getting a jump with transplants really helps. Getting a jump so that the squash is more mature and more ready to vine and has a stronger vascular system. I actually find that the vining, if the squash is able to vine and root well,
right.
it can, of course. I mean, who knows how infested, depending on the year, it can outgrow it.
Right. We've had experience sometimes. What we have typically done when we first saw the sign of the borer was we would slit the stem, try and find the borer, and then we would find nodes along the vine that were starting to root or that looked like they had the potential to root, and we would just loosen the soil and kind of tuck them in a little bit to encourage rooting further along the vine.
Right.
And sometimes we used to get maybe a 50% rescue rate out of that, but we were able to save some that way.
There's a technique that I think was inadvertently being used down in the South, where before the squash ran, you would go through with a harrow and really harrow very close to the plants, and that would end up burying the tips of the squash. And the squash would then grow through that kind of mound of soil, but that little mound is where there was a pretty serious root that took place. And I think inadvertently that was, I know that awful machadas are less susceptible to vine borers, but at the same time, I've seen that as an interesting technique where right before they vine, going with a harrow really strong in the patch and burying what seems like, oh geez, what are you doing? But then seeing it grow through and continuing to be strong. So there's also some breeding, there's some breeding that's going on related to very strong rooting, and where the node literally is basically got a root that's like 8 inches long and basically like a secondary root system. So that may result in a relatively, quote, resistant squash in the future. I think the maximas are really, they're a huge problem with the maximas because they're not adapted to it. They're from South America. They obviously did not encounter the vine borer pest in their evolution in the same way that the machadas probably have. And the Peppos seem to be kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It's like some do, some don't, with the vine borer.
All right. That was a great question, Christy. Thank you for that. In our 10 minutes left together, I just want to give another chance for people to put in their questions and to give you some shout outs and some notices of things coming up. As I was beginning to mention, a contemporary and a person that works heavily with Heron, Petra Page Mann from Fruition Seeds, she is also presenting during this conference if you want more information about hand pollination, and she will be headlining a webinar that is separate from this as part of NOFA's Inspiring Ideas. That will be the last Tuesday of this month at 4 p.m. If you would like more information, you can contact me directly, but she will be going over hand pollinating of squash and cucumbers and melons, getting into some of the science, but also what other cultures do with this. A lot of cultures in the Caribbean, parts of the South, and our Black and brown communities, they do this quite often. So she's going to be talking a lot about that. So in our last few minutes, go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the other great things is just for folks just sort of picking up on that, is that these quote immature winter squash varieties are amazing fresh as zucchini. So things like baby Hubbards, you know, baby Butternuts, you know, if you're playing with this hand pollination thing, just be aware that when they get to be about the size of a softball, or you know, around that sort of bigger than the tiny ones, but even the tiny ones, you know, just quickly pan fried, are actually have a lot more flavor and texture than your standard zucchini. There's also, you know, there's like fun stuff is like there's also squash varieties with edible leaves, which is something that actually has a, not only is it wonderful to eat, but actually we're discovering that these edible leafed squashes, the bitterness that is present in regular normal squashes is what keeps this, is what the striped cucumber beetles are trying to eat. And the non-bitter edible squashes are less attractive to the striped cucumber beetle. So we start to see, like, as we just pay more attention, and I think that's the thing that hand pollination is fun, is that you start to just really pay attention. I just think that's where I'd like to ask everyone just to sort of look at what's going on. You know, don't just take it for, you know, don't just take for granted that that bean plant does what it does. You're going to see all kinds of differences by variety, and you're going to see all these really interesting nuances about, you know, why this one sets well in the heat and this one doesn't. And it's just a really wonderful world in the garden that is such a, you know, particularly right now when I think a lot of us need some distraction. Rather than checking the Facebook feed in the morning, maybe go out and look at some of those tiny flowers and just, you know, appreciate what we're doing, you know, and feed each other. Save seed, feed each other. So thank you, everyone, for, if there's not another question, I'll let you all go eat dinner.
Thank you so much, Heron. This was such a wonderful presentation, informative. I agree with Jessica. We should give a clap hands for you, that this was great. And while you're eating dinner, for your listening enjoyment, in between sessions, we will have live music. I put the link in the chat. If you want to go check that out, get your groove on while you're eating, while you're waiting for the next session, feel free. For those that were asking about Petra's presentation, at the end of the month, I put my email in there. You can email me directly. I'll send you the link for that. That is a free webinar. But again, please catch her during this conference. If you like what Heron had to say, she's phenomenal, and you really will enjoy it. Heron, thank you again. I think we're about it. There's no other questions, so please enjoy yourself. Check out the next sessions that start at 7.
Yep.
Check your book. Go right ahead.
Petra is way more interesting than I am. So Petra is a great friend and such a, you know, knowledgeable person, and she's way more fun than I am. So if you liked this, you're gonna love that. So I'll probably be on that one. So really, you know, check it out. And I think there's going to be other seed saving stuff maybe with this in the workshops too. So
yes.
Thank you, Anna, for moderating everything very much. You know, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to everyone. Look forward to seeing you throughout the conference. So enjoy yourselves. Have a good night, everyone. See you soon.